is Paul Franz of the Stavros Niarchos Foundation. And in that capacity, he leads digital and visual projects to elevate the stories of its worldwide grants. He merges his expertise in journalism and storytelling with technical acumen that spans multiple disciplines, which include video production, motion design, data visualizations, GIS, and web development. Prior to joining the foundation, Paul was the creative and technical lead with the Ideas Lab at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C. There, he held the inaugural Andreas C. Dracopoulos Chair in Creativity and Innovation. Other career touchstones include a journalism fellowship with the Pulitzer Center on Crisis Reporting and Time. Welcome, Paul. I'm going to stop sharing my screen so you can jump in here with us now. This is going to be great.
Yeah, thank you, Sherry. Thank you for that kind introduction. Give me one moment while I get my presentation queued up for y'all. Hope you're having a good morning and a good afternoon. Really excited to be talking to you about the work that I've been able to achieve the past 10 years in Washington. A disclaimer though, I am speaking on my own personal capacity. I am now based in New York City, and I also hold a non-resident fellowship with Csis, but I don't work with them full-time any longer. So everybody see my screen? Everybody's got visuals here? Very good, very good. So what I want to talk about today is ideas. How do we communicate ideas to audiences in an age of fast-moving disinformation and misinformation? And one of the long-running jokes in Washington especially is, if you don't know what a think tank is, it's very quickly, it's a government-adjacent institution in which people who have been in government or are angling to serve in government go to do research and develop ideas about policy. So at CSIS, one of the, as I said, one of the long-running jokes that we had was the traditional output of a think tank was the 100, 200-page PDF report that would be no more than a paperweight on a congressperson's desk that nobody would ever read other than the 5 most interested people in that particular policy sphere. So the problem and the challenge that I worked to address this past decade was to reinvent that. How do we take the traditional research product and make it into something more widely acceptable, widely understood, and more easily digestible by a wider audience? Because in this era that we live in right now, it's no longer a top-down approach to communication and communicating ideas about government and policy. It is a horizontal playing field now in which public debate and public perceptions matter a great deal. So as Sherry said, I had previously been a journalist before I got into the DC area. And I took a lot of that expertise and experience to inform what I did at CSIS. And so I'll bring you back to a day long ago. Some of you probably weren't even teenagers yet, but I started my career in communications in 2006. I joined a newspaper as a print reporter, really at the tail end of the existence of newspapers. And as an older millennial, I'm one of the last generations in the world that ever knew an era where the internet wasn't a thing. And so I remember being at a convention, 7 or so, and this was a recurring thing. It was a convention for journalists, but I would frequently go to seminars and workshops and roundtables in which journalists would wring their hands and be like, you know, we're really afraid that this 1,000-word piece that I wrote last week, people don't read beyond the jump on the front page. And if you don't know what a jump is, because some of you are younger and probably have like very minimally engaged with newspapers as a traditional product, is the jump was you'd have the first 200 words on a front page, and then the jump would say, go to page A7 in the interior of the newspaper to continue reading the story. And so there was these long conversations and workshops about, well, how do we encourage readers to, continually engage with the story and not just read the headline or the first 100 words, as it were. The reality is that we're still, 13 years ago that was a problem, but we're still in that same boat. I mean, the medium has changed, the way stories are presented have changed, and it's not really a attention span problem. Everybody always said, well, people in this era have the attention span of a goldfish. But the problem and the challenge that think tanks had especially was that, they had an attention getting problem. They were very set in their traditional ways about producing these 100, 200 page research reports that didn't really distill what people had to know, what policymakers and business people had to know. And so I don't know if Sherry has sent to you all the New York Times article for discussion today, but it's about a very important issue that I don't think a lot of Americans are terribly familiar with. And that is what is happening in the South China Sea. And the South China Sea, if you don't know where it is in the world, is the major body of water that is just directly south of the Chinese mainland. And since the mid-aughts, about 2005 or so, there's been something serious developing there. And that is the Chinese Navy and the Chinese government has sanctioned an aggressive base building campaign in which they are going out to what is not only a very small rock or coral reef in the middle of this body of water, taking these large dredging ships, sticking a giant pipe to the seabed floor, and then pouring sand and concrete over these features to create military installations. And this is all done in an effort to raise its military profile and presence in what is one of the most trafficked shipping lanes in the entire world. A large percentage of our goods and items travel through this body of water. And a lot of people don't know that. So back in 2014, CSIS's Asia Pacific researchers wanted to publish a new report about these efforts. And the initial thinking about this was, well, we're just going to push out a report and call it a day. But in this particular instance, my department and the researchers, we came together and we said, well, how do we really make an impact with this? How do we bring this issue to the front page of every newspaper and news agency in the world? And so we had a novel idea, which was we knew the location of these bases being built in the South China Sea. And we went to a commercial satellite company known as Maxar Technologies. And what Maxar does is they have satellites, many hundreds of satellites orbiting the Earth. And you can tell them at any point, if you can pay for it, go to a certain point in the world with these coordinates and take pictures of it. And so that's exactly what we did. And what wound up happening was what you see here. And there's a really great backstory to this photograph. And for those of you who don't know, this is like a quintessentially Washington photograph too. There's so much hidden meaning behind this if you weren't familiar with it. But the man in this photo is Admiral Harry Harris. And Admiral Harris was, during the Obama administration, the commander of PACOM, and he is currently the US ambassador to South Korea. And what Admiral Harris is pointing to here is one of the images that CSIS procured from Maxar Technologies. This is known as Fiery Cross Reef, one of these Chinese military bases. And the great irony of this photo is, this is Admiral Harris. He's one of the highest ranking military commanders in the United States military and intelligence apparatus. But for the longest time, he saw these pictures, he had access to them, but because of classification rules, he could never show them publicly. But because we were able to commercially acquire these photos and then mark them up, if you look closely, you can see where our researchers said, well, there's the airstrip, there's the bunker, there's the barracks, and all this kind of stuff. But because we commercially acquired them, they were in the public domain. We could release them freely and show them. And so this really, and this was a presentation in front of the Senate Armed Services Committee. And so for the first time, these images were no longer just the province of intelligence agencies. These were publicly released. They were widely available, and the world saw them, and they said, wow, this is what's actually happening. And they understood it on a completely different visceral level that, you know, a 100-page PDF report could have never achieved in 100 years. And so here's a great example of the output of this work, which, as you see to the right, a front page of the New York Times from April 2015, using CSIS's imagery to really drive this issue home and show what was happening. And if you look closely at this front page, you can see the ships and their giant tubes of sand building out these military installations. And indeed, if you look at the quote on the left, we had journalists, academics, and everybody saying, you know, CSIS has definitively affected the course of the public debate and perception about this particular issue. And indeed, after all this was coming out, it forced, you know, not only a change in the public debate, but also a debate amongst policymakers. And you had President Obama and Premier Xi Jinping address this openly at the conference known as the Shangri-La Conference in Southeast Asia. So what was CSIS? So CSIS struck some gold here. They said, wow, if we could do this with some very strategically placed visuals, what else can we do this with? And how else can we affect this public debate and inform this public debate? And so since 2015 up until, well, ongoing now, but continuing even after I have left CSIS in a full-time capacity, they had really doubled down on the use of mapping and imagery and being able to leverage this content in a way that helped really expound upon other issues, not just the South China Sea. And so not only was imagery a key component, but as using interactive maps and dashboards and being able to show geodata in a way that wasn't just a written product. And so the environment that we find ourselves in is, if you look back at the front page of a newspaper, you know, for hundreds of years we've had newspapers, but the thing that makes the internet and storytelling on the internet so interesting is that your tool set is now expanding. We have many, many, many more choices in the ways that we present information, and that tool set is expanding by the day and year. And we're also not limited by the traditional output of print. You know, with print, you have 2 or 3 options at most, right? You have the image, you have text, and if you want to be a little creative, you have data visualization, bar charts, graphs, maps, things of that sort. But with the internet, that toolbox is expanding every day, and our choices are limitless. It's based on what technologies and web browsers can support. So I want to show you one project that I spearheaded. We started about 2 years ago. CSIS started about 2 years ago. It is ongoing, but it is an interesting twist on the map formula. And so I'm going to show you a video from one of our experts, one of CSIS's experts.
China is asserting claims to all the waters and airspace of the South China Sea. And they're doing it not primarily with military or law enforcement vessels. They're doing it with an armed militia that camouflages itself by operating on fishing boats. The maritime militia is really the tip of the spear for China's power projection in the South China Sea. So the South China Sea is the most contested piece of geography on the planet. The largest recent deployment we've seen of this militia has taken place over the last 7 months around Thitu Island, which is occupied by about 100 Filipino civilians and a small military contingent. China has had dozens of these militia boats surrounding the island every day. On a shot from December 20th, what you see is 95 Chinese boats, the heaviest day that we have monitored around this feature. Every one of them are large, none of them broadcasting the signals that they should be to avoid collisions, none of them with nets or other gear in the water, none of them fishing. They just sit there for long periods of time, monitoring and intimidating the Filipinos. It seems clear that China's goal in the South China Sea is to establish effective dominance of all the waters and airspace within what they call the 9-dash line. They don't want to do that by fighting a military conflict with the United States or anybody else. What they want to do is use civilian actors, these paramilitary forces, to effectively control the space, make it impossible for their neighbors to operate, and therefore win without ever having to fight. The US needs to turn away from strictly military responses. The US Navy has a role in deterring outright aggression and backing up our partners. But the US Navy cannot secure fishing rights for Filipinos. It can't secure law enforcement rights for the neighbors. The only thing that can do that is a diplomatic and maybe economic effort and try to convince China to modify its claims and especially its behavior, to take these paramilitary forces off the board before there's a crisis.
So this became a medium that we like to lovingly call at CSAS the map video, the map briefing. And so it is certainly different from what you would have normally seen vis-a-vis something like Google Map or Bing Map or whatever it might be, where it's just a either still image or something that was interactive where you can pan around and zoom to different locations. In this case, it was very much a project where we took the native advantage of video storytelling and combined it with the data-rich environment that geospatial visualizations afford. So I think some of you have communications backgrounds or journalism. Is that right, Sherry?
I would guess so. And
okay, so this is going to be especially relevant to this crowd. So really interesting observation about the way I technically made it. I didn't write a single line of code. You don't have to be a developer to make this stuff. So if we've got any video experts or editors in this audience, you'll be glad to know that the technologies have become so democratized that map making can be for a video professional if you want to do that. So you don't have to be an engineer. GIS is becoming more and more widely available to folks to use in different contexts and different mediums. And if you're interested in knowing more about how this was made, check these tools out on the right. Most of them are free to use. Mapbox especially, and is a great entry point to understanding how geodata works and is visualized. If you have some expertise in After Effects, the actual video that you just watched was created entirely within After Effects with some extensions. But that costs a little money to get started. But if you want to get started with map making and video right away, Google Earth Studio, which was just released last year, it's currently in active development, but it is free to anybody who has a Gmail account, gives you the ability to quickly make video visualizations with maps and geodata. But I think this was the key lesson that I learned and took away from my 10 years in DC. There is, as a communications professional, if you're in policy or working in policy adjacent fields, the overwhelming desire, the motivation for researchers who are not communicators by trade is to create endless repositories of data and information. They do not know how to contextualize that information well, and they do not necessarily know how to communicate those key takeaways well to the appropriate audiences. And so this was, if I had to sum up my biggest lesson that I learned for anybody going to DC or going to work in a policy field, is what you see here. You need to think about things in terms of narrative. You have to create stories, not repositories. And when you break down what this video does, what you had just seen is that, I mean, the key takeaway, they tell a damn story. You're not overwhelming people who do not necessarily share the same level of knowledge or expertise about the South China Sea or the military maneuvers and developments there. You know, you're not creating what I like to call dashboard hell, which is, here is all the data and here's all like the 100 different things that you can do with it. But what good is that to non-experts who don't know what to do with it at all to begin with? Some other comments about this is, you know, like I said, you don't have to be an engineer, you don't have to be a cartographer necessarily, and you don't need to be a GIS expert to produce what you just saw. I have no geography background whatsoever. I didn't study it in school. I took maybe like one intro to geography class when I was an undergraduate, but beyond that, I was never formally trained in any of it. And a really important salient point is not making any assumptions about the technical capacity of your audience. And I'll relay an interesting story. Back in 2014, a researcher and I were invited to do a presentation at the executive branch, right next to the White House, at the old executive office building. And we had just built a new website and a series of data visualizations. It was this great new online tool that we built. And I was deathly afraid of showing something at a federal building that wasn't sufficiently secure. And so I went through all the motions of securing it, password protecting it, doing multi-factor authentication, the whole 9 yards. But when I first talked to the logistics person who coordinated everything technical in the executive branch, his first question to me was, can you show this website on a CD-ROM? And I couldn't believe what I was hearing, but this is a thing because the federal government has something called a SCIF, which is a secure communications environment in which no external signals can breach. And so you have to show everything locally. But the really nice thing about video is that, yes, I can put a video on a CD-ROM, and yes, I can easily play that anywhere I wish. So what happened with CSIS? What were some of the outcomes, the practical outcomes of the map video series, high resolution? We saw in mid-2019, we knew in July that Iran had been planning an organized strike against Saudi Arabia's oil infrastructure. And indeed, we predicted exactly how it happened in September 2019. So we came out with a video in July, and 2 months later, our predictions came true, and the Iranians struck with drone technology a oil refinery in the country. One of the more big policy achievements that CSIS made was really exposing and showing the shortfalls of the Trump-North Korean negotiation strategy. While the summits that President Trump had with Kim Jong-un were very flashy and making a big splash, we showed that without any serious debate or discussion with the North Korean regime about its missile-based infrastructure, the summits were pretty hollow. And quantitatively speaking, we had great engagement from the audience and the viewers, really a remarkable completion rate. And completion rate, for those who don't know what that is what was the percentage of the audience watching these videos that watched it from beginning to end? And so that number was over 80%. And of course, one of my favorite achievements was the president himself tweeting about some of the videos and research reports we were putting out about the North Korean missile-based strategy. He felt compelled to directly respond to that, especially since the New York Times picked up our research, CSIS's research, and he said, I will be the first to know, the first one to tell you, the American people, if things go bad with this strategy. And so that really encapsulates everything that CSIS had done with me the past 10 years. It was a really exciting time to be in Washington. I'm happy to be in New York now and in a different field altogether. SNF is a philanthropy, so I will not be doing too much national security work in my near future, but I will be definitely doing a lot of mapping work in geospatial, because geospatial as a field is growing in importance, and it's growing and it's growing horizontally. So it's no longer just the province of geo nerds and map makers. It's going to have direct relevance to everything that we're doing in education and policy, and indeed philanthropy as well. So I'm happy to take your questions and discuss anything that we've covered today. Thank you.
Awesome. Awesome. One of the first questions is, can you share a link with all of us to that video you showed, or is it
Yep, it's publicly, absolutely. It's publicly available. There is a playlist of the 20 episodes produced to date. I will put it in the chat for you all to enjoy.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you.
There you are. It was a really fun series to produce. I'll miss not doing it anymore, but it is in very capable hands, and I'm very excited to see what CSIS does with it in the future.
Well, I think we are too. So if you haven't put a question in the chat, feel free to unmute yourself and go ahead and ask a question. I know I have one, and that is, like, who did y'all have to get permission from CSIS to share some of these images, and it's essentially data with the public?
So that's a great question. None of the images that you saw in that video, or indeed in anywhere in this playlist, if you watched all the videos, were classified. They were not from government sources. They were paid for or accessed through a private company, Maxar Technologies. And so through the course of research, the researchers actually knew where these locations were, and while they didn't see it, they knew it was happening through myriad sources. And as a result, they had the coordinates of it. And all they had to do was say, all right, here are the coordinates of this particular military base. Send your satellite over there, take some pictures and share it with us. And as part of that agreement, we could publicly release them.
That's awesome. We do have a question in the chat. This is from Anna Prado, and she says she's been reading about multimodality and digital storytelling.
Yeah.
And your projects seem so appropriate for learning at any level. Can you speak to the classroom value of digital storytelling and where you see this field headed in the next few years?
Yeah, I want to, yeah, that's a great question. So I think first and foremost, I think we need to drop the modifier there and stop saying like digital this or this or e-library, e-report, whatever. It drives me crazy because everything is digital now. You don't need to specify that anymore, right? Like if you're not doing a project or telling a story electronically or digitally in some form, you're not doing storytelling well. You know, so I think when I do a more broader lecture about the state of this field and everything, I just say, you're just doing journalism or you're just doing storytelling. Like if you have to caveat it, you fundamentally misunderstand the nature of the world of communications now. Where I think it's moving is, let me put it to you this way. When I got my master's degree in journalism, tablets weren't a thing yet. Android wasn't a mobile operating device. I entered my master's program at the University of Miami with a dumb phone, like a flip phone. We weren't, and this was just 10 years, I'm not that old, guys. This is just like 10 years ago, right? And in that span, the nature of how we pass on information and distribute it has vastly changed. We saw in the 2008 presidential campaign, like President Obama was dabbling with Twitter, right? But it was nowhere near the kind of vehicle for information it is now, where could you even imagine a presidential campaign that does not natively work with these platforms? Okay, like I remember, so in those 10 years, think about how much has changed. And think about the pace of that change and now multiply it by 10. And then next year, multiply it by another 10. So what you're gonna see in the next decade is more change, but even a faster rate of change. And what you will start to notice is, if you want me to speak about specific technologies, Give me one moment. I'm going to show you something really cool here. I just purchased this little device. This is an Oculus Quest 2 by Facebook, and it's a VR headset. It cost me $300 to buy. This technology is getting cheaper and cheaper and more accessible, and the ability to produce content for these devices is also becoming that way. So if you want to ask me what we're going to see in 10 years, think about even greater immersive kind of storytelling experiences. If you can get the price of this device down to, $100, I could only imagine the kind of potentialities we'd see with this kind of stuff. It's pretty cool, by the way. I mean, it is a Facebook product, so say what you will about Facebook, but it's a pretty fun device to play with.
Okay, so John Carlos put in the chat, thanks so much for the presentation. And yes, here's a question. How do you think private groups being able to capture images and collect data previously only possible for complex government systems affect the relationship between journalists and government authorities? That's one question. And he has a follow-up. Will more information become more publicly available over time?
Yes. Yes. I think the challenge right now is that we live in an unprecedented time in terms of the amount of data that we have access to. And the challenge for journalists especially is how to make sense of it all. Mm. And my best advice to you, if you're going to be a journalist, is don't waste too much time learning specific technologies. Learn not the what, but how to learn them, because those technologies are going to constantly change. That said, what you do need, and professors love me when I say this, is don't ever forget the fundamentals of good storytelling or journalism. Like the who, what, when, where, and why, and inverted pyramid, and the arc of good storytelling, that hasn't changed. So even if you're developing stuff for, VR, yeah, like the techniques are changing, but the fundamental underlying structure of a good story does not change.
Got it. Let's go back, if you will, to his first question, which was, how do you envision this relationship between journalists and government authorities in the future?
So let's dive deeper on that. What do you mean exactly? What about the relationship?
John, do you want to speak to that?
Hi, yes. I was just wondering about, because you mentioned how as a private company, you were able to collect all of this information about the South China Sea and get images. And that kind of technology was only available before to government agencies. So now as more information is becoming publicly available through private means, how do you think the relationship between what governments are able to keep to themselves and what the public is able to see changes? How will that relationship shift?
Yeah, well, I mean, the quick answer to that is you can't really keep a secret anymore. And I think one of the things that the North Koreans learned was that, yeah, they could try to hide their missile program as best they could, but I mean, even you didn't need national security agency or like the CIA to tell you that anymore. What you had was just people in the open source community saying, well, there was a missile truck there and it's not there anymore. Where did it go? So you're going to find that, and there are, I'm not an expert on this, but there are instances where, the absence of something is actually more telling than the presence of something. And I wish you should really look into the field of imagery analysis, because they can tell. I mean, they are visual investigators. They can look at these images and say, oh, I've seen them work before, and they say, how the hell do you know that there was a missile silo there, or there's a storage unit under there? And it's like, oh, well, you know, I can see the tracks here or the shadows being cast in a certain way during times of the day.
That's amazing. Good deal. Do we have another question?
Somebody's asking about the legal aspects regarding the distribution of sensitive information. That's not a, I mean, I'm assuming you're probably alluding to like WikiLeaks and things like that, right?
Well, hi, Mr. Paul. I was actually wondering, because a few days ago, when the whole riots were happening at the Capitol, interviews came out later where they were showing videos of the secret chambers or the halls and the tunnels. And I was wondering if there's like any legal aspects that you've seen changed within the past 2 decades to prevent or that allow these things to be happening due to the technology, right? Because we have this rising technology, but then we also, I feel, have like other issues that become presented with these innovations.
Yeah, it presents an interesting set of challenges and balance between national security and the open community of like freedom of speech and freedom of information. Unfortunately, I'm not an expert in this, so I wouldn't feel very comfortable commenting on like the complex legal or ethical issues surrounding it. There are some great researchers at Csis that talk about, you know, disclosure and information. So I'm not the best person to ask that question.
Thank you.
Yeah, sure.
Not sure if this is a similar question or different, but Anna Aguilar says, I imagine there has been a backlash from foreign governments upon the release of images that may be of security risk to them. What laws would a private company have to follow when taking pictures of, say, a military base in Taiwan? And she says, I'm not super well versed in international law. Aren't there some laws prohibiting this? So yeah.
There are, and for instance, you can't get all the imagery in the world from Maxar. Like for instance, you need a clearance, a security clearance to see certain things. And in those cases, the access to that is highly regulated. So I think a good example, you cannot get imagery of Area 51, for instance. Right, like you can't, like I don't have a clearance. I can't just go to Maxar and say provision the imagery of that. And if you look at Google Earth, it doesn't. It's like blacked out at a certain level. You can't see beyond a very, very high level of detail, or excuse me, a very low level of detail.
And so we have another question. What would be the best way to get involved with storytelling in DC or even CSIS?
Yeah, I think that's a great question because don't think of it narrowly. Every institution in DC needs good storytellers and good storytelling. So if you're dead set on journalism, unfortunately, there's only a few outfits in DC that fit that bill for you. So one of the things that I thought was worked for me when I first started there, and I hadn't been at CSIS the whole time, I'd only been there for 8 years, but you know, I was pretty open-minded about what industry I went into. And so the really exciting thing about this is that this is a new emerging field. Organizations and institutions are finally realizing that, slowly, albeit, they're finally realizing that they have a need for this expertise in-house, and you need people who are digitally native and able to explain and show narratives in these new emerging mediums. If you're interested in CSIS specifically, there are always rolling internships at the Ideas Lab. There is literally on the masthead a link to the Ideas Lab and its careers page. So if you're interested, highly encourage you to reach out. If you want to get specific context, feel free to email me.
Excellent. Would you mind putting your email in the chat while we're talking about that? Because I bet at least one person is going to want to follow up with that. Excellent. Does someone else have a question?
I have one.
Go ahead.
Thank you for the presentation. It was very, very eye-opening. And
Of course.
I study international relations, and I wonder who, like, are you doing this like by yourself, or is there any like a team of, I don't know if consultants, but like the professionals analyzing all these pictures and like the consequences that they could bring? I don't know if it makes sense.
So at CSIS, there's a team of about 20 people in the Ideas Lab, and they span multiple disciplines from audiovisual production to data scientists and web developers. So it's a pretty robust department within CSIS. In terms of imagery analysis, pretty much anybody in the defense industry is going to have people like that. There are, beyond CSIS, one of the big agencies is the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, NGA, and they do this like every day. That's their mission, right?
Of course.
You have a couple other organizations in charity, and I think a lot of what you saw with the developments in Xinjiang and China with the Uyghurs being imprisoned, you saw a lot of satellite imagery at play there, and people analyzing these camps that were built and saying, well, these were people were being sent to.
Thank you. And I mean, like, is there, sorry for a follow-up, but is there any like action taken after these type of things come out? Like, is there a diplomatic consequence or anything that gets moved by it?
Yes, well, sure. So in the case of the South China Sea, the public perception and understanding of that issue forced change at higher levels. Because it's not, whereas 50 years ago, all you had to influence were the people in the smoke-filled rooms and like the high-level ranking representatives and decision makers. But now so much of that thinking is influenced by public perceptions too. So in terms of like the great, I hate using war words to describe it, but in the great, conversation that we're having about certain issues, understanding the impact of public perception is critical.
Thank you. Yeah.
One of the things I was thinking about was this, like the video you showed actually opens up space for a reaction other than a military reaction, which doesn't mean it wouldn't be, grand in scope as far as the reaction. But what if it didn't involve the loss of lives, and yet things happened in a way to discourage that intimidation that's going on in the South China Sea? So for me, it was like a positive thing. Yes, you're exposing sort of this negative situation, but maybe opportunities now come to light that wouldn't have otherwise.
Yeah, so your question is about impact, right? Like, how do we, if people aren't necessarily, how do we get people to care? Is that what you're angling at? So I would say in the case, with the thing that I just showed you with Greg Pauling and the Filipino fishers is, well, nobody's really dying in that, not at least at a large scale. But we showed the real economic impact of what Chinese activities are doing to other claimants in the South China Sea. You remember that map. South China Sea ain't a sparse area. You've got 7 other countries who have claims to those bodies of water. And what you have the Chinese government and military doing is that they're saying, no, we own all of this, and we have all the rights to the oil, the gas, and the fish. And on the latter point, fish, you have a great and growing demand for food. And that's not a trivial thing. And so, this issue is cross-cutting in multiple ways. It's not just fishermen losing their livelihoods. It's about being able to adequately feed populations. And both, I mean, Vietnam, the Philippines, Malaysia, Brunei, they all have good faith claims, legally sound claims to these waters.
All right. Any other questions out there? I don't want to cut anybody off. So let me just look one more time around the screen. This has been a very enlightening presentation, I think, for all of us, and exciting for those that are interested in the field. So thank you very much, Paul, for joining us today. And thank you for sharing your email. I'm assuming if you have a question that didn't get answered in this space, you can reach out to him as well with that. So I would, in just a minute, after I make sure no one has any questions, I want to go back to those opportunities that I mentioned at the beginning. I think Yenny wanted to speak to them herself, and that didn't work out. So any more
Thanks
questions?
Oh, I won't jump in.
No, go ahead.
Anybody has a question? No, I was going to say thank you for having me.
Oh, no, our pleasure. And thanks to all of you for showing up today for the Tuesday Times Roundtable.